afternoon, guys, and welcome back to the channel. It's a lovely Saturday morning here in the UK. Sun's out, birds are singing. So while all my neighbours doing their gardening are out cutting their lawns, I wanted to share with you guys the world's most famous case of deflation. What better way to spend your Saturday? This was posted on February the 5th, 2016 via the Visual Capitalist website. And this is a two-part story, and I've also got a final third page to finish off this little mini season I'm doing. So let's get straight into it. Part 1. The world's most famous case of deflation. The Great Depression. The Great Depression was the most severe economic depression ever experienced by the Western world. Now, straight away, let's just get a few things straight. Lots of things have happened in history. Quick example being Rome. So would Rome class as the Western world? I would kind of say yes. So is the Great Depression the worst? I would say no. So again, with these reports, do take everything with a slight pinch of salt, but use it for informative purposes only, and try to gauge the best you can whereabouts you think we fit in the line of history. Okay, I'll carry on. It was during this time that the world's most famous case of deflation also happened. The resulting aftermath was so bad that economic policy since has been chiefly designed to prevent deflation at all costs. Setting the stage. The Roaring Twenties. During the 1920s, economic growth picked up as new technologies like the automobile, household appliances, and other mass-produced products led to a vibrant consumer culture and growth in the economy. Private debt in the US. More than half of the automobiles in the nation were sold on credit by the end of the 1920s. Consumer debt more than doubled during that decade. So I hear a lot of reports about how much the car industry in America is financing out their vehicles and then paying that car off over years. So how dissimilar are we from the 1920s in respect to the automobile credit scheme? Let's carry on. So this is a chart representing the GDP in the 1920s to the just to the beginning of the 1930s. So the GDP of the United States, and unfortunately all this does is cover the United States. We can't get a broader spectrum of Europe countries and other areas, so apologies for that. Now in the 1920s, GDP was floating around the 575 to 600 billion mark, which sharply increased to their peak in 1929 to about 800 billion. So within the span of 8 years, it increased by roughly 50%, which is huge. Now what is actually quite interesting is this little back drawing here, which is saying highest standard of living in the history of the world, standing on a mountain of peak of prosperity, looking down at an ancient Roman, funnily enough, following on from the last story. Now, the way I'm kind of viewing things at the moment is we are not dissimilar from Rome at all. The only things that change are the clothes and the material items around us and the infrastructure. The man still remains the man. We do not evolve, but the mindset is we are. And I think that's one of the biggest illusions. Man does not change. Okay, moving on. Black Thursday. October the 24th, 1929. The Roaring Twenties ended with a bang on this day. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 11% at the open in a very heavy volume, precipitating the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression of the 1930s. So here it's representing the huge 11% drop-off and the start of Black Thursday. Income inequality during this era was the highest in American history. By 1929, the income of the top 1% had increased by 75%. Income for the rest of the people, 99%, increased by only 9%. The top 1% of Americans stood for 1.2 million people, and the bottom 99% represented 122 million. Now, when you take that into context of today, this bottom number, I believe the population is in the region of about 325 million people. So it's no longer the top 1%. It's now the top 0.1 or 0.01%. So that has drastically dropped. You can probably take that down to maybe 100,000 people, 10,000 people, something like that. So it is massively reduced. But this number has massively increased. So the inequality gap, as we all know, has massively shifted from what was supposedly the worst time in history. I'd have a stab in the dark and say the bottom now represents something like 300 million people. Maybe 20 million people are somewhere in the middle, and a very small fraction are at the top. A few hundred people or a few thousand at tops. Perspectives on the Great Depression. Economists continue to debate to this day on the cause of the Great Depression. Newspaper, which is the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Wall Street in panic as stocks crash. And a couple of small stories. Attempt made to kill Italy's crown prince. Hollywood fire destroys films worth millions. I can't quite make this one out, but I'm sure it says assassin caught in Brussels, MI6. Here's perspectives from 3 different economic schools. John Maynard Keynes saw the cause of the Great Depression hinge upon a lack of aggregate demand. This then became the subject of his most influential work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which was published in 1936. Keynes argued that the solution was to stimulate the economy through some combination of 2 approaches. Approach 1, reduce interest rates. That's the monetary policy. Approach 2, government investment in infrastructure, fiscal policy. And we've all heard about fiscal cliff and things like that. And this is a quote from John Maynard Keynes, representative of the British Treasury. Quote, the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. Monetarist. Monetarists such as Milton Friedman viewed the cause of the Great Depression as a fall in the money supply. Friedman and Schwartz argue that people wanted to hold more money than the Federal Reserve was supplying. As a result, people hoarded money by consuming less. This caused a contraction in the employment and production since prices were not flexible enough to immediately fall. Milton Friedman, American economist, quote, the Great Depression, like most other periods of severe unemployment, was produced by government mismanagement rather than by inherent instability of the private economy. End quote. Austrian economics argue that the Great Depression was the inevitable outcome of the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve during the 1920s. In their opinion, the central bank's policy was an, quote, easy credit policy, unquote, which led to an unsustainable credit-driven boom. And how does that relate to today? Murray Rothbard, American heterodox economist of the Austrian school. An increase in the relative size of government in the economy therefore shifts the social consumption investment ratio in favour of consumption and prolongs the depression. Depression and inflation. Between 1929 and 1932, worldwide GDP fell by an estimated 15%. deflation hit, personal income, tax revenue, profits and prices also plunged while international trade fell by more than 50%. And the reason international trade fell was because the credit markets dried up. And that's why everything will become a localized trade only in your cities and towns. And these guys weren't as nearly connected as everything is today. And just remember that. 1929 to 1932, change in economic indicators. The blue is representing the United States, the light grey is Great Britain, dark grey is France, and black is Germany. Unemployment in the US rose to 25%, and in some countries rose as high as 33% unemployment rate. 1 in 3 people were unemployed. And you have to bear in mind that everything in the global markets today is 100 times worse than what happened here. The debt is hundreds, if not thousands of times higher than what was here in 1929. Unemployment rose in America 607%. Great Britain saw 120%. France saw 210%. And Germany saw 225%. Industrial production. United States dropped 46%. Great Britain dropped 20%. France dropped 23%. And Germany dropped 38%. Wholesale prices. USA dropped 32%. Great Britain dropped 33%. France dropped 34%. And Germany dropped 28%. Foreign trade. USA dropped 70%. Great Britain dropped 60%. France dropped 55%. And Germany dropped 60%. So all those items that come from abroad to stock your shelves stopped. That is exactly why you could only rely on local items. We're so used to having anything we want from any part of the world on the shelf. You have to start getting used to the idea that those sorts of luxuries will be ending, and will be ending quite possibly for a decade period, subject to how quick they can turn things around and put us into a one world government. We'll cover that on another video. These statistics were only the tip of the iceberg. Learn about the full effects, the story, and the recovery from the Great Depression in part 2. So let's head over to part 2. Part 2. Life and Times during the Great Depression. And this was published on March the 13th, 2016. Life and Times during the Great Depression. The Great Depression. In just 3 years, worldwide GDP fell by an estimated 15%. Deflation hit and all economic indicators went haywire. The economy of the United States was destroyed almost overnight. More than 5,000 banks collapsed, and there were 12 million people out of work in America as factories, banks, and shops closed. Well, let's think about today. How many factories do our Western countries have? The whole industrial element of our countries has been slashed to almost being non-existent. Everything is imported from China, from India, Taiwan. How much industrial items do we really make? Nowadays, everything is just technology based. Everything is sales based. So how much worse is this going to be when it takes down the entire network? What I see as being important is getting educated in things that can be of help, that you can trade your labor to do something productive. People are going to need basic things being done. People are going to need food. So you should be learning how to create food, not just going down to the supermarket and taking it off the shelf. You should be researching how to create it, how to grow it, how to cultivate it, and how to harvest it. You should be learning how to maintain things around your home. You should be learning how to be creative. And you should be learning how to not just consume, but to also give back. And that's one of the reasons I'm doing these videos. Let's move on. So 1929 to 1932, change in economic indicators. Yeah, well, this was all covered in the previous video, so I'll skip straight on. The deflationary spiral. After the stock market crash, money and consumer confidence was hard to find. Instead of spending money on new things, people hoarded their cash, kind of repeated on the last story. Less consumer spending meant more drops in demand and prices, which led to defaults, bankruptcies, and layoffs. Fall in demand, fall in prices, debt defaults, bankruptcies, layoffs, and wage reductions equals the deflationary spiral. Now, I believe in today's market, they are going to do everything that they can to prevent deflationary events. So what's the opposite of deflation? It's going to be hyperinflation. And we can already see that happening in many places around the world already. And one thing that's quite interesting is watching how things unfold in other nations that are unfortunate enough to be going through this situation today, right now, as I'm recording this and as you are watching this. These things are happening in the world. And those people that ignore that fact are just deluding themselves to their small little bubble they live in, thinking everything's going to be fine. These things are coming to our countries. It's just a case of when they are ready to implement this situation. There's only a select few people that are controlling this event globally, and they are not capable to deal with all the issues that arise in a controlled collapse of these states to fully manage it. So that is why you're not having a global event all simultaneously at the same time. They are focusing on weak nations that are already unstable and ensuring that they are acquiring all the assets that they want from those nations in order to turn them into a slave colonist state. And unfortunately, all the while they're doing this to millions of people at a time, but in small pockets around the world, the rest of the world are not interested in those other countries. They are only interested in themselves because people are selfish. And that is what society has taught people. That is the social movement of people. If you go back to the 1950s when people got out of this Great Depression period, they were having street parties, they were happy, they were talking to their neighbours, they're doing lots of activities in social groups. Where are we today? We are alienated, we are divided, and our families are split up to seek employment in towns and even countries miles away from our originated places, all in the system that we have been driven into and forced to conform with. Otherwise, we end up on the street with nothing. And people just go along with this because they know no better. And they have the great dream of becoming wealthy and financially independent. And to do so, we all have to go to college, we have to get fantastic degrees, and that's just not the case anymore in today's world. It worked for the baby boomers who are now fortunate enough to have ridden that upward trend. But what I would say over 95% of the baby boomers are unaware of is what is just around the corner waiting for them, and that is this event. So their life work is going to be ripped from them, and they're going to be slammed right back into the stone ages of this depression period where nothing is moving. There's no currency, there's no M2 funds running through the nations. Everything seizes and dries up. And that's the reality of the case because history doesn't lie. Let's move on. As a result of this spiral, the prices for many food items in the US fell by nearly 50% from their pre-war. As a result of this spiral, the prices for many food items in the US fell by nearly 50% from their pre-World War I levels. Now, this is in a deflationary period, and we know deflation is not occurring in today's world, because as soon as deflation happens, the wealth of the people just gets sucked out of the nations. And there's nothing more obvious than wealth being sucked. What we are in is in the opposite, where everything is inflating in price. And the baby boomers that are benefiting from this inflationary period gives the artificial illusion that everything is absolutely fine. Property prices going up, but what is actually happening is all the food prices are going up with it. So we're having this effect, but the other extreme. This is one extreme, we are having the opposite extreme. Both lead to the same outcome. There's just two different ways to get there. You can't stop either path. Either path leads exactly back to the medium, which is total collapse and total correction. Unavoidable. So here you can see prices of things deflating from the set prices on the right, the deflationary prices on the left. We are going the other way. So this would be the prices that we are in today, and this is the prices we can expect to be paying tomorrow. The effects. Here's how real value is affected in a deflationary environment. Cash is king, and gains in real value. Cash will always be king, especially while people are unaware of true assets like gold and silver. They are so brainwashed into believing that this paper is valuable. You see, it's nicely rolled up like toilet paper. That's its real value. House prices. It's in the asset column. If you know anything about houses, and if you own one and you're paying a mortgage back, it's not actually an asset, it's a liability. The only way a property are assets are if you are generating a positive cash flow from them. Well, this is an inevitable outcome that will be occurring globally. Nothing can go up indefinitely in a cycle system. And from what I'm hearing, a lot of prices in America are actually coming down now as we speak. Funny enough, I saw a video yesterday which was talking about how Barclays in the UK is now offering 100% mortgage for properties in the UK. But there are small clauses attached to it, which you'll only be accepted basically if you're earning over £50,000 a year. And I believe the average income here in the UK is something around £18,000. So you need to be in an extremely well-paid job. And that's not all you need. You also need to pay or have a huge amount of cash in a bank and deposit it Barclays Bank. So this ties into what I believe is a surefire way of taking a huge lump of cash off the middle class. And as we're all aware, they are trying extremely hard to eliminate the middle class. And one fantastic way of doing that, and bear in mind the baby boomers mindset, is property prices are always going to go up. There's just so many people that need homes and not enough homes. They can't even fathom the possibility of a housing crisis. And if there was a housing crisis, it will be short-lived. So with saying that, let's just think about a middle-class person for a moment. Now, hypothetically, imagine I'm a middle-class architect and I happen to have £100,000 just sitting in my bank account. I've done pretty well over my life. I've got 3 properties that I'm renting out, and my money's just sitting there. And now I've got this letter through the post telling me my money is no longer secured to the amount that I believed it was. And I covered that in one of my previous videos, so please go check that out if you haven't already. So he's sitting there with 100 grand in his bank. He knows he's done very well on his other properties that have all risen in price, and he's got a passive income not only coming from his job but also the properties he's attained. So he sees this fantastic offer that Barclays are now doing, where all he needs to do is put 50,000 down into a bank account with Barclays, and Barclays will buy the house for him. So he sees it as, okay, so I put down this 50k, Barclays buys the house, and in 10 to 15 years, I'll have another house paid off. But what he's not taking into account is he is putting 50,000 and he's then going to rent this house out. Now, I've done the calculations in the UK for rentals, and basically in today's market, the rental cost does not even cover the mortgage payment that I would have to make if I made this move. So I decided against it a few years ago. Now I know interest rates have dropped a little bit since then, so maybe the numbers have changed and it might just be at a slight profit now because they're just giving money away. So I'm getting off topic a little bit. So the point I'm trying to make, so this guy puts 50k down into this bank account and takes out this 250, 300,000 pound mortgage, which the rental is hopefully covering that mortgage repayment. But he now has 50 grand locked into a bank to act as a security deposit. Now that money is what I say, it's just a security deposit. It doesn't go into paying any down payment. It's just it's a safety net for the bank to know that you've got some money to cover that loan. So the bank is offering you 100% on that property. What's not been taken into account is bail-in scenarios. This is happening all over Europe, where banks are starting to introduce negative interest rate, which means you're holding that 50k in the bank. Well, guess what? We're going to charge you for that 50k. So immediately he's down on that 50k. Every single month he's getting charged negative, subject to where he's living in Europe. And imagine a scenario where a bank bail-in occurs. So when that bank bail-in hits him, like it did in Austria recently, and I wonder if the Austrian situation happened due to their Austrian economic standing, because as we know, Austrian economics don't agree with the Western banking system. So one way the Western banking system can hit Austria hard is by doing the first bail-in down there. And that's when they took 54%. Not too long ago, I think maybe 6 weeks ago, they did a 54% haircut. So you've just put your 50 grand into the bank. Well, if you do a minimum of a 50% bail-in, which is inevitable, where you just lost 25 grand. So you're now liable for that 300 grand mortgage, and you've now lost 50% of your 25 grand covering that property. Now the systemic situation that would occur is the 54% bail-in was actually just to prop the banks up because they were having issues. If the economy collapses and if the derivative market explodes, that 50 grand you got in the bank is gone. 100% gone. So poor Mr. Accountant has just taken out another 300 grand loan. He's put 50 grand of his hard-earned money into it. He may have done a 50,000 deposit into the bank for one property, and he may have done it again because, you know, these guys are greedy. We all want more and more and more. We're never satisfied with what we have. So hypothetically, he could be 600 grand in debt through the bank, not even taking into account his own private home. And that's where it gets extremely complicated, because when a system collapses, it sucks everything down. When that derivative market blows, It's taking everything down. Now the poor accountant is going to be 600 grand in debt, and he will have lost that whole 100,000 deposit. So effectively, he's now 700 grand down. And when those tenants stop paying the rent, because guess what? They've lost their jobs. And when Mr. Accountant has no more contracts, guess what? He can't cover those payments. And if he's fortunate enough to have those other properties paid off, then at least he still remains some equity. But he's going to be stuck in a bit of a predicament where he's either going to have to sell off some of those houses to repay whatever balance is due, or the bank is just going to confiscate the 2 new houses that he's got the 300 grand mortgages on. And can you imagine if those other houses he hasn't paid the mortgage off on? Well, guess what? They're going to come for repossession also. So for his whole life's work, 7 years of university, 8 years of university, going through the ranks of creating wealth, getting into that fine job, maybe building his own architecture firm, the whole thing just gets swallowed up. And that is how I feel we're going to lose the middle class. And then what happens to that middle class that are supposedly highly educated? Well, guess what? They end up in exactly the same position as everybody else. And they're no longer affluent, but they will have the mindset of being successful. However, they couldn't be further from the truth. They will have the most stark wake-up call known to mankind. And that's just the accountant. So yeah, slightly diverted on that, but let's move on with debt. Debtors owe more in real terms. So the debt goes up and the wages go down. Well, as we know, our debt, the average debt per capita is massive. Everything our governments are doing are basically putting so much debt upon each person that's born. I mean, it's a crazy amount. It's like every baby that's born has multiples of thousands of debt on their head as soon as they're born. That is how much is inside this derivative market. Interest rates up, we're the opposite. Interest rates are down. So everything that's occurring here is, just flip it the other way. But that only occurs for so long because they both return to the medium. From bad to worse, the Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1939, a 10-year span, 1 decade, which was unprecedented in the length for modern history. To this day, economists disagree on why the Depression lasted so long. Here's some of their explanations. And in the was not enough column, we have, looking back at the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes believed the monetary policy could only go so far. The central bank could not ultimately push bank lending, and therefore demand had to be created through fiscal policy. Keynes advocated massive deficit spending to offset market failures to recovery. Keynesians such as Paul Krugman believed that Franklin D. Roosevelt's economic policies through the New Deal were too cautious. Quote, "You can't push on a string," unquote. John Maynard Keynes, representative of the British Treasury. And on the things that made it worse column, some economists believe that the New Deal had a negative net effect on the recovery. The National Recovery Administration, NRA, is a primary subject of the criticism. Established in 1933, the goal of the NRA was to lift wages. To do this, it got industry leaders to meet the established minimum prices and wages for workers. So what's going on at the minute? Everybody's demanding more money. Everybody's saying we need to increase our minimum wages. Like in my previous video, you can find out more there. Cole and Ohanian claimed that this essentially created cartels that destroyed economic competition. They calculate that this, along with the aftermath of the policies, accounted for 60% of the weak recovery. Lastly, one other change levied at Roosevelt by his critics is that the sprawling policies from the New Deal ultimately created uncertainty for business leaders, leading to less investment and lengthening the recovery. And this is a quote from Cole and Ohanian, professors of economics. Quote, the abandonment of Roosevelt's policies coincided with the strong economic recovery of the 1940s, end quote. The Federal Reserve didn't do enough, Colin. Friedman and Schwartz claimed that the Federal Reserve made the wrong policy decision, which extended the length of the Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, the monetary policy dipped 27%, which decreased aggregate demand and then prices. The Fed's failure was in not realizing what was happening and in taking corrective action. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, American economists, quote, the contraction is a tragic testimonial to the importance of monetary forces. Different and feasible actions by the monetary authorities could have prevented the decline in the stock of money. This would have reduced the contraction's severity and almost as certainly its duration. And in the shouldn't have done anything column, Austrian economists believe that the Fed and the government both made policy choices that slowed the recovery. For starters, most agree with Friedman that the Fed's policy choices at the start of the Depression led to deflation. They also point to the premature tightening that occurred in 1936 and 1937 as a policy failure. During this 2 years, the Fed not only hiked interest rates, but it also double-banked reserve requirements. These policies coincided with Roosevelt's tax hikes, and a recession occurred within the Depression from 1937 to 1938. Critics of these policies say that this delayed the recovery by years. This is a quote from Friedrich Hayek, Austrian and British economist and philosopher. Quote, I agree with Milton Friedman that once the crash has occurred, the Federal Reserve System pursued a silly deflationary policy. I'm not only against inflation, but I'm also against deflation. So once again, a badly programmed monetary policy prolonged the Depression. Personal stories from the Great Depression. This is from Vane Scott in Ohio. Quote, One evening when we went down to check on the bank, there were hundreds of people out front yelling and crying and fighting and beating on the locked doors and windows. They had fires built up in the street to keep warm, and there were people milling around all over the downtown. This is from James Randolph, Ohio. Quote, a friend I worked with said in the Depression he rode on the rails and stopped to eat vegetables out of a garden. The owner said he would shoot him if he didn't stop. My friend said, go ahead, as he was that hungry. This is from Gladys Hoffman, New York. Quote, when neighbours couldn't get a loan from the bank, they'd come to Dad. He sold farm machinery. He never put his money in a bank. He stored it in a strongbox in the fruit cellar, under the apples. He'd loan the neighbours what they needed, and they'd pay him back when they could. If there was a month, especially the winter months, when they couldn't pay, they'd slaughter a cow or a pig and give him a portion. In the summer, it was vegetables, corn, peas, whatever they had grown, end quote. This is from Arville Pearson, Arkansas. Quote, I thought the Depression was going to go on forever. For 6 or 7 years, it didn't look as though the things were getting better. The people in Washington, D.C. said they were, but ask the man on the road. He was hungry, and his clothes were ragged, and he didn't even have a job. He didn't think things were picking up. After the 1937 to 38 recession, the United States economy began to recover. The focus of the American public would eventually shift away from the Great Depression as events in Europe unfolded after Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. So immediately after this Great Recession and Depression, They went straight back into a war that then lasted for several more years. So it was only until about the 1950s that things started to increase and get better again. And here we are, one generation later, that are oblivious to what happened for the generation before them. And that is exactly why people's understanding and knowledge is gone and forgotten, because it was already dying out. Those stories are dying out. How often does the youth, the millennials, talk to older generations about history? It doesn't happen. They're just too busy playing on their Xboxes and being dumbed down by the system, which is exactly what the system wants. So that's where that story finishes, and it's not quite as brutal as I was actually expecting, and it doesn't hit home to the real extent and pain that people will have lived through. But just because it doesn't say the gritty details, you have to use your imagination, if you don't know of anybody that lived through this time, to just think about what exactly life would be like when a system collapses. They drive you into war. They clearly drive you into war because it's the easiest way to hide it. Money is only money. Money's not important. The only things you need are people, reliable people, and a food source and a water source. Everything else is material in life. Sure, it's great to have these things, but if you haven't got protection in place, it's those sort of people that are going to lose the most. And unfortunately, you can look at 99% of people on the street, and they're the ones that are going to be losing everything. You can see these guys driving past in fancy cars, when in reality, they should have put that money into more humble ways. And I look at these people with very different eyes than what I used to a few years ago. I now feel sorry for these people that they are going to lose everything. Just look at this picture here. These kids, grubby, tattered clothes. We are being set up for the biggest evil transfer of wealth. Also, that the powers that be can create what they call the New World Order, where a very few people control everything. And for some people, maybe life won't be too bad. Maybe life will become better in their New World Order. But for 99% of everybody else, I'm afraid you're the guys that are going to be sent to war. You're the guys that are going to be depopulated. You are the guys that are going to have no chance of getting out of the life that you are now placed in. Something I learned this year is how I believe it's 2/3 of the world earn less than, I think it's $2 or $3 a day. And you have people in the West complaining about their living standards. I recently went to the Philippines, and the average wage out there, funnily enough, was about $2 to $3 a day. And these people are living on it, but they're happy. They struggle, but they live within their means. But something that they have is they have an abundance of cheap food, rice, coconuts, fruits, and you have to look around your towns and cities here. What do you have? How many fruits do you have? How much rice do you have? How much clean, fresh water do you have? And I wonder, because we look at these people that are unfortunate enough to live in these third world countries, they are stuck in poverty, and it is impossible to climb out of that hole. Impossible. And you're earning, call it $15 an hour. They're getting $2 to $3 a day. They can't even buy an ounce of silver. All they can do is feed themselves. That's it. They just have enough to feed themselves. And that goes for 2/3 of this world. It puts a lot of stuff in perspective. And if you think, and people don't appreciate, one, how lucky they are with being born in the West. And it's only when you open your eyes fully that you can appreciate that. And it's your duty to break out from the indoctrinated, brainwashed mindset that has been set upon you to want these fads, to want these material items that are of no worth or use. Because you'll wake up one day and what you think it is, it's not. If you think it is worth $100, $200, tomorrow it's going to be worth nothing because nobody's got anything to buy it for. You might get a carrot for it. And the system is designed to implode from the start. It's just how it works. So if it is designed to fail, the reason for that is because the end goal is control of the people. Real money is just an exchange of wealth, and wealth is gold and silver. You exchange your time for gold and silver in traditional terms. So because we have been brought up on this fiat currency, we have lost the real wealth of people's labour. So for the last 60 to 70 years, people have worked for nothing. So the people in power are going to siphon 60 years worth of the population's work and in turn wealth. And that is a huge gain for the elite cartel that run this planet. 60 years of free populational wealth. Billions of people working for 60 years plus, given all that wealth to a few. That's what happens when a derivative market explodes. You often hear the saying, nothing in life is guaranteed, apart from you're born, you pay taxes, and you die. Well, there will come a time where there are no taxes to pay because nobody is employed. It's just a free-for-all. So then the only guarantees are you live and you die. But I'd like to introduce one more guarantee. This collapse is happening. And it's happening around us now. The only thing that's not guaranteed is when it becomes official. And when they pull that final switch to collapse and drain the system. And when that happens, everyone will become awake. But that will be too late. So ensure you're set up and safe now, guys. It's better to be prepared and ready, even if you can't do everything you want. You can't buy all the things you need. Like me, I can't buy everything I would like because I just don't have the funds. So you have to prioritize what's important. And first on the list is make sure you have some food. Some of those sealed packs that last for many years, because the best thing with those are, although they're expensive, you don't have to worry about them. You can just put them away and they're there. They will last years. So you are prepared food-wise for years. It's all about making sure you can sleep well. Once you're awake to the situation of the world we live in, it becomes a race to get prepared for it. Life will not continue the way it is today. And judging from history, the periods of the collapses span, unfortunately, for a good portion of our lives. And it doesn't become better for at least a 20-year period. And because we have had such a prolonged period of prosperity and artificial stimulated markets and manipulated markets, it just goes without saying that we will have a severe drop in those markets, followed by a prolonged collapse before restructuring takes place. And you'll be looking at least a 20-year period, which then puts it into the frame of your children. So it's going to be your knowledge now and whatever assets and protections you can put in place now to teach the next generation about what really occurred and how to really protect wealth. And there will be so many people with nothing. There will be so many people going out and looting and trying to steal everything because be a free-for-all. But the hardest thing I find is finding people you can talk to about this, because people shut down. Their mindset just shuts down. They can't cope with negative information. They don't believe events like this occur because it's been brainwashed out of their mindset. We used to be hunter-gatherers. We used to prepare for winter seasons. What's happened to that? We just do a weekly shop. We really need to create strong communities where we can defend each other and help each other. And the only way I see in my town that I can do that is when people become awake during a collapse, because you just can't wake these people up. That's my biggest struggle. How would I try to reach out to these people? And these people are going to be the people that are banging down your door, seeing if you have food. And they're going to see people like us are eating. We're not losing too much weight. So then you become a target. So I'm still trying to find out and figure out how I would personally deal with that situation, because we need people to survive from people. We need to have groups to defend from groups, because it's gonna be like The Walking Dead. But the one benefit of the UK is, well, at least they're not going to be roaming around with too many guns. But that doesn't mean they're not going to be carrying other weapons. The trick is obviously to get out of a city. And what I've seen on other videos are, you want to get 3 days walk from the nearest town. And for me, that's a little bit hard because I don't have the funds to make that move. So I'm stuck where I am in a town. And all the preparations I make, in reality, might be for nothing. But if you don't make them, you stand almost no chance. Anyway, I'll leave it there, guys. And nice bit of doom and gloom for a Saturday afternoon. Or evening, or Sunday morning, wherever you are when you're watching this. Thanks a lot, and please do leave some comments, and maybe if you have some ideas and information for me or other links that will help me develop my mind and my plan for what to do when this situation comes, I really appreciate that. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one, guys. Thanks a lot.